Good day. Over the last few hours, I understand that the United States, the White House to be precise, has made certain comments, presumably the White House spokesman, in effect confirming that Ukraine's spring offensive, much discussed spring offensive, is now a summer offensive, with the assumption, I suppose, that we can nonetheless expect it to happen at some point over the next few weeks, at any rate over the course of the summer. Just to reiterate again, this was an offensive that was first discussed in the autumn. It was supposed to follow directly after the offensives in Kharkiv and Kherson. There was going to be an offensive strike to cut the land bridge between Russia and Crimea. I remember seeing reports about this appearing in Slavyangrad and other places in the autumn. And there was some discussion about it happening over the course of the winter, but it never materialized. Then in January, there was talk that this offensive might happen at the end of March, and the tanks were supposed to be provided by the Western powers in preparation for this. Though those tank deliveries were delayed and proved fewer in quantity than many anticipated. And then, of course, there were reports from the Pentagon leaks that the offensive was supposed to take place on the 30th of April. That was supposed to be the launch date, and then it was postponed again, and then it was supposed to happen in the later part of May, and again it failed to happen. And here we are now in June, and it's no longer the spring offensive, now it's become the summer offensive. I should say that following my programme yesterday, somebody reminded me quite properly that back, I think it was in October, the two principal Ukrainian commanders, General Zaluzhny and General Syrskyi, gave, along with their nominal chief, President Zelensky, a lengthy interview to The Economist. And in that interview, General Zaluzhny was discussing this offensive, this very offensive that we're talking about, and that confirms that thinking about this offensive goes back certainly to the autumn of last year, the autumn of early winter of last year. And of course, in that interview, Zaluzhny set out what he felt he would need for the offensive to take place. He spoke about at least 300 modern tanks, and it was clear he meant Western tanks, 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles, and 500 155mm howitzers. And of course, he's not received anything remotely comparable to those figures. The number of Western tanks he's been provided is just 60, less than a fifth of what he asked for. He's had around 250 tanks provided altogether, but most of these are derivatives of the Soviet era T-72 tank provided by, I believe, Slovakia and the Czech Republic and Poland, and also some T-55 tanks provided by, I believe, Slovenia, which have been heavily modernized, but which are still essentially elderly tanks. And that's the bulk of the tank deliveries he's received. And as to the 600 to 700 infantry fighting vehicles, he's had 100 Bradley tracked vehicles, 100 Stryker vehicles, of which there has been a report that around 3/4 of them are prone to constant mechanical breakdowns. That's appeared apparently in the American media. 40 German Marders. Apparently that number is to be increased. And that's it. That's far from the 600 to 700 again that Zaluzhny was talking about, if of course you count Western infantry fighting vehicles. He has had other infantry fighting vehicles provided, again, based on Soviet models, but it's clear that that wasn't what he was expecting. And of course, the big story is artillery, because as many people have pointed out, this is essentially an artillery war. He wanted 500 howitzers. He's not been provided with even a fraction of that number. And we've had now comments from Jens Stoltenberg and Ben Wallace, the British Defence Secretary, both telling us that Western supplies of equipment are now depleted. The way they speak is essentially exhausted, and that realistically they can't supply more. And in fact, we've had some further figures about this. This is from La Repubblica, the same Italian newspaper that a few days ago was reporting that some people in the West are now pressing Ukraine to make significant territorial concessions to Russia to end the war and freeze the conflict in return for a promise of EU membership, of accelerated EU or perhaps even NATO membership, something which the Ukrainians, for the moment, are pushing strongly back against. Anyway, La Repubblica has now provided us with some ammunition numbers. They say that the United States has increased its production of ammunition to around 400,000 rounds a year, and that would come to about 33,000 rounds a month. That's between 6 and 7 days of current ammunition consumption by Ukraine. The United States would be producing in a month as much ammunition as 155 millimeter ammunition as Ukraine uses in a 6 to 7 day period. And the European Union is far below these numbers. It's only producing around 50,000 shells a month, 50,000 shells a year, which is around 4,000 shells a month. So the United States is producing around 33,000 shells a month. 33,000 shells a month. The European Union is producing around 4,000 shells a month. Ukraine, as I said, is consuming shells at the rate of, significantly higher than these production numbers. But perhaps the real contrast is what American sources are telling us about production figures in Russia. Currently, the Russians are said to be producing around 200,000 shells a month, which would be, roughly 6 times the American figures. So that gives us some idea, as I said, of the level of discrepancy. Of course, as I said, these are all estimates about Russian figures. The American figures come from La Repubblica, but you can understand why Ben Wallace and Jens Stoltenberg are talking about the depletion of Western arsenals, the inability, in effect, to supply more. And of course, we've been hearing a great deal about Western officials fanning out across the world to try to get some kind of weapon systems that they can find and transfer to Ukraine. And up to a point, they've been successful. They managed to get around 500,000 shells from South Korea, for example. And they've also obtained some shells, we've no idea how many, from Pakistan and perhaps also from Egypt. But again, this is only plugging the gaps. And it seems that this pool of equipment, of ammunition, of weapon systems is also now largely exhausted, that they're not going to be able to provide more. And I think the reason Ben Wallace and Jens Stoltenberg are making these comments is because Ukraine is now basically telling them that it doesn't want to launch this offensive at all because it doesn't have anywhere near enough weapons to make the offensive a success. And above all, it doesn't have anywhere near enough ammunition. It needs far more ammunition than the West has supplied. And with the Russian air and missile offensive underway, which I discussed at length in yesterday's program, it's very likely indeed, in fact it is all but certain, that Ukrainian ammunition stocks have been depleted further. We know that the Russians have struck ammunition depots in Pavlograd and in Khmelnytsky, and quite plausibly in Zhytomyr as well, and perhaps Ternopil, according to Shoigu. We don't know how many shells of the shells which the West has supplied the Russians have destroyed, but it's likely they've destroyed quite a few. And it's not surprising that the Ukrainians, short of shells already, are coming to the West and saying, we can't really begin this offensive until we receive more shells, more equipment, more weapons. Now, yesterday I said also that despite all these problems, despite the fact that Ukraine is so short of equipment, it continues to come under relentless pressure from its Western sponsors to launch its offensive. And we saw this again with Ben Wallace in this interview he gave to the Washington Post, in which he basically admitted that Western arsenals are now depleted. Because he said that he thinks that the offensive that Ukraine is supposedly going to launch might very well succeed. He thinks that if things all go well, then perhaps Ukraine might be able to capture Crimea, even though that is not the conventional wisdom of most people in the West. And I'm going to suggest again that these comments from Stoltenberg and Ben Wallace ought to be clearly understood for what they are. In the case of Ben Wallace, definitely, and in the case of Jens Stoltenberg, probably, they are once again, in effect, instructions to Ukraine to stop prevaricating and launch its offensive. And Ben Wallace is saying, you can succeed in this offensive because even though your forces are depleted, the Russians are even more depleted than you are, so you can launch this offensive with every prospect of success, because even though you don't have many shells, you don't have many tanks, you don't have many infantry fighting vehicles, the Russians also are going to run out of supplies of all of these things over the course of that offensive, and the result is that you will be able to capture Crimea. Now, I'm going to say that I am sceptical that Wallace himself actually believes these claims. It hardly seems probable that Wallace is ignorant, completely ignorant, of the military-industrial realities that have been discussed at such length by people like Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vashinin, Brian Beletic at the New Atlas, and also altogether by the Royal United Services Institute in Britain, which is providing a detailed analysis of the condition of the Russian armed forces in Ukraine and essentially admits that the Russian armed forces have upgraded significantly, that they are a much more formidable force than they were this time last year. So far from being depleted, according to the Royal United Services Institute, the Russians actually are much stronger. There's more of them, and they are better organized, and they're better equipped, and the air defense system is working at very high levels of efficiency, and their communications and command systems have been sorted, and their tactics have improved. And anyway, in summary, it's the opposite of what Ben Wallace says. So presumably Ben Wallace is aware of all of this, and I can't imagine that he doesn't understand the implications. So only two possibilities exist. Either Ben Wallace discounts all this information from ODYSEE, from people like Alex Vershinin, from others. I doubt that he listens to Brian Balletic or to this channel, but anyway, perhaps he discounts all of this information and all the information that's been pouring out in the American media, the American military media, and some reports that every so often come out in the British media. Perhaps he really believes the narrative that has been so zealously promoted both by Ukraine and by some people in Britain, that Ukraine is carrying out all these successful operations, it's damaging the Russians, it's causing the Russians major injury, that the Russian military is a degraded, depleted, run down, broken down force. Perhaps he believes that. Or alternatively, he too is now so invested in this offensive. He's, after all, given away much of the best equipment that the British military has. He apparently overruled his own army officers to send the Challenger 2 tanks to Ukraine, or some of them at least, that he has to have an offensive, and he is going to insist that Ukraine conduct this offensive. And he's telling the Ukrainians, well, you must carry out the offensive with what you have, because it's going to be enough, however little it might seem to you to be, because I know that the situation of the Russians is even worse. So that's the kind of pressure that Ukraine is coming under. Now, will the Ukrainians launch this offensive this month? I think highly likely they will, but as I said in my previous program, we'll have to wait and see. Meanwhile, the media in the West, as a number of people have spotted, is currently engaged in a very intriguing practice. They've been promising their viewers and their readers for months now that Ukraine was going to launch this make or break spring offensive. And the offensive hasn't yet happened. So we have all of these attacks that Ukraine is launching or trying to launch in various places. And of course, yesterday we had that other attack which Ukraine launched in Shebekino, where they tried to capture Shebekino, and the battle there, as we know, resulted in Ukraine suffering very heavy casualties. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry has actually provided an updated account of that particular battle. They've now increased the number of Ukrainian troops who they say was killed from 30 to 50. They've given a sort of running account of the battle, which basically seems to have lasted about 6 hours, with various units of Ukrainian soldiers, small groups of Ukrainian soldiers, trying to cross the border with the support not just of infantry fighting vehicles, but also of tanks. I understand actually that up to 5 tanks were involved, and the Russians responding with artillery and aircraft and bombing these soldiers. So the number of Ukrainian soldiers that the Russians say were killed in these attacks, they've now put at 50, more than the 30 they were saying yesterday. And they've also said that several armoured vehicles, Ukrainian armoured vehicles that participated in this attack were also destroyed. And they claim that not just these armoured vehicles were destroyed, but Ukraine also lost a number of pickup trucks and soft-skinned vehicles as well. It's quite an interesting account if you go to the Russian Defense Ministry's website of the attack that took place. And clearly, this attack, so far as I can see, was intended to capture ground. It was clearly an attack intended to capture either Shebekino or the border post or parts of either, and to sort of dig in. Though it was repelled with heavy losses, exactly like that earlier attack in Belgorod, the one that took place in Belgorod. And I'm going to suggest that, in fact, these attacks, which are clearly attempts by Ukraine to capture positions, they have now come to be used both by Ukraine itself and by the Western media covering this war, the media that has been promising the Western public this offensive for so long. They're being used in a rather clever way, because they're always now described as shaping operations, battles that supposedly take place whereby Ukraine supposedly is trying to shape the battlefield in preparation for this big offensive that it is going to launch. And of course that, as a number of people have pointed out, means that on the one hand, the Western media can say, well, this offensive isn't yet happening, but we're getting these shaping operations instead. Alternatively, if any one of these attacks succeeds, if, for example, Shebekino were captured, even though it would be a matter of absolutely no tactical significance whatsoever, well, you can then come round and say the offensive is actually underway and it has achieved its first success. It's, as I said, quite a clever PR strategy, in my opinion. But what I would say is that we should not be fooled by it. These are not shaping operations, whatever that is supposed to mean. If the intention behind shaping operations is to try to change the contours of the battlefield, to weaken enemy positions, to gain fortified positions, to deplete the enemy, to cause them severe losses, well, that's not what these attacks are achieving. On the contrary, it is the Ukrainians. The overwhelming evidence is that it is the Ukrainians who are suffering the losses, who are losing machines and equipment and men in these attacks, which are straightforwardly and simply being repelled. They shape nothing, they change nothing. That, it seems to me, is completely clear. And of course, again, I speak as someone who has no background at all in these matters, but that seems absolutely obvious to me. Now, let's look at what's going on the other side, because of course the Russians, as I discussed yesterday in my other video, are not idle. They're in fact extremely busy. They're doing all kinds of things in different parts of the war. Specifically, we have now had Abdi Aludinov, the head of the Akhmat Special Forces Command, which essentially is the umbrella organization of the Chechen fighters who are participating on the Russian side in this special military operation. He has now confirmed that he has received orders, as I discussed yesterday, to launch an offensive, to undertake offensive operations in various places. Now, yesterday I assumed that the place that he was focusing on was Avdiivka, and some reports that I saw in places like Radovka seem to support that. But in fact, it's now clear that he personally is commanding the Chechen regiment. There's apparently 3 in total, but the Chechen regiment that has been deployed to Marinika. And Marinika is a small town not far from Donetsk city, I believe to the southwest of Donetsk city. It's been intensely fought over for many months. Back in October, the Russians briefly, though falsely, claimed to have captured it. They never fully captured it. But anyway, the fighting has been going on in Marinika for months. It's one of these heavily fortified small towns that Ukraine controls near Donetsk, which it has tried to use to fortify in order to press its effective siege of Donetsk, which it has been conducting ever since the fighting in 2014 and 2015. And I've, over time, come to the view that the Russians have been using Marinika rather like they previously used Bakhmut, just as they delayed the capture of Bakhmut and left routes into Bakhmut open because they wanted Ukraine to reinforce its positions in Bakhmut, because the primary purpose of the fight in Bakhmut was not so much the capture of the town itself as the elimination of the Ukrainian troops rushed to defend it. I think the Russians have been doing the same thing on a smaller scale in Marinika ever since at least October, and with deadly success. And I've spoken in earlier programs about the really harrowing pictures I've seen of Marinika. There have been pictures clearly made by drones, which give you an overall view of what was the town, and it has been leveled. I've never seen destruction on this scale in any battle up to now, in any place up to now in this conflict. And I have to say that is actually saying quite a lot. So Alaudinov is saying that he has now received an order from no less a person than Vladimir Putin himself, apparently. I don't know whether he's in direct contact with Putin. Maybe Putin gave the order to the to the commander of the Russian forces, who's Gerasimov, who passed it down perhaps to Kadyrov, who gave the instructions to Alaudinov. But anyway, Alaudinov says that the order has come from Putin to clear Marinika, to finally end this battle for Marinika. And sure enough, a couple of hours later, we heard that Russian forces, which of course include these Chechen forces, have now captured a position in Marinika, a heavily fortified position Ukraine still retained on the outskirts of Marinika. Alaudinov has said that his force, which if it's regimental sized, perhaps numbers 2,000 or 3,000 men in total, it's a guess, that it is actually supported in this offensive by no less than 2 Russian motorized rifle divisions. So this is a substantial force, perhaps, let's say, around 20,000 men in total, committed to the battle on the Russian side in Marinika, with the intention of finally capturing this town. Now, if the Russians do capture Marinika, and on past experience, the Ukrainians will fight for every stone of what they still control in Marinika before they finally give it up. If the Russians capture Marinika, that apparently puts them in a very strong position to press the attack on the much more important town of Vuhledar to the south. Now, Vuhledar is important because it's the linchpin of Ukrainian defenses in southern Donbass. Rather like Bakhmut, it's close to railway lines. There's an important railway line that runs close to Vuhledar, the control of which would significantly simplify Russian communications in the area. It would enable the Russians to move troops into what's left of southern Donbass. It would probably mean that the Russians would have little difficulty in rolling up southern Donbass fairly fast. But also, if Vuhledar is captured, then it seems to me, from my reading of the maps, please don't assume that my reading of the maps is ever particularly accurate. I've spoken many times of my difficulties in reading maps. But if Vuhledar is captured, then I think that the Russians would be strongly positioned on the flanks, on the eastern flank of any Ukrainian offensive pushing south towards the Sea of Azov. I wonder, in fact, whether in the event that Vuhledar were to be captured by the Russians, such an offensive would become a practical proposition at all. So, it might make sense, therefore, with Bakhmut out of the way, for the Russians to try to wrap up the unfinished business in this part of Donbass, which might explain the reputed order from Putin to the Russian military to finalize once and for all the capture of Marinika and perhaps press on to Vuhledar. Vuhledar has occasioned the Russians many problems. It's a smallish place, but it sort of rises out of the landscape in a series of typical Soviet-style high-rise apartment buildings. These are not only natural fortresses, but they also enable Ukraine, the Ukrainian troops who occupy these high-rises, to survey the entire area, monitor the entire landscape, and that helps them use their artillery to strike at any Russian forces that try to approach Vuhledar, either from the south or from other locations. And several Russian attacks on Vuhledar have been repelled, often with heavy losses. But of course, if Marinika is captured to the northeast of Vuhledar, it opens up another line of attack for the Russians. It might conceivably, I suppose, put the Russians in a position where they can interfere with Ukrainian reinforcements to Vuhledar, which would, of course, probably render the town undefendable. So you can see what the Russians might be trying to do. Anyway, we'll see whether that works out. But this is what Alaudinov has said. And there's been perhaps equally dramatic news from other places, because at the right other end of the battlefields, the front lines, there's reports that the Russians have not only reached the industrial zone of the town of Kupyansk on the Oskol River. This they managed to do several weeks ago, but they're now actually apparently enlarging the area of control around Kupyansk, and the Ukrainians apparently are now starting to worry that the Russians are preparing to actually recapture Kupyansk. Now, Kupyansk is a fairly small place. It's about, I believe, around 30 to 50,000 people. It's smaller, therefore, than Bakhmut is by, or Artyomovsk is by comparison. But it was the center, the headquarters, if you like, of the Russian-administered parts of Kharkiv region until the Ukrainian offensive of the autumn. The Ukrainians captured Kupyansk in the autumn, and it was perhaps the single most important town that they were able to capture over the course of that offensive. Now, if the Russians are able to recapture Kupyansk, then conceivably it opens the way for them to move west to recapture ETHEREUM and press home their attacks on first Liman and Seversk, which must also be high on the agenda, and prepare again for the attack on Slavyansk in the north, even as their forces in the south, presumably advancing from Artyomovsk, the former Bakhmut, will be pressing on Kramatorsk further south. Kramatorsk and Slavyansk are the former conurbation. Slavyansk is in the north, Kramatorsk is in the south. It was where the uprising in Donbass properly started in 2014. It started in Slavyansk. If these two towns form the last significant defense line that Ukraine has in Donbass, if they fall, then the way is open for the Russians to advance to the Dnieper. So you can see that it makes sense for the Russians both to push forward in Marinika and to push forward in Kupyansk. And, well, to be frank, these not only look like real attacks in real places, but unlike the kind of attacks that Ukraine is indulging itself in on the Russian border, these do look like real shaping operations. And they perhaps give us an important clue as to what the Russians are doing. And here I'm going to make a further comment. I think that the Russians, probably back in the autumn, decided that their best strategy was to fortify their positions, grind down the Ukrainians in Bakhmut, build up their military, and wait for this Ukrainian counteroffensive, and then repel it, and only after that counteroffensive has been repelled, only in that case, launch an offensive of their own. So those like me, who thought that the Russians in the winter might be intending to launch an offensive, I suspect that that was never the Russian plan. However, I wonder whether the Russians are going to wait indefinitely for this Ukrainian offensive, which is always postponed and which never comes. They must have a pretty good idea of what the condition of the Ukrainian military is. There's a really rather distressing article in The Guardian the other day in which he talked about Ukrainian forces that are training to take back Bakhmut. By the way, an interesting admission from The Guardian that Bakhmut has fallen and is under Russian control. The Ukrainian government, Ukrainian officials, have still not formally confirmed that, by the way. But anyway, this is a really rather sad article because it talks about these soldiers who were training to recapture Bakhmut. And it had some of these soldiers admitting that the regular army has now replaced the Wagner forces in Bakhmut. These soldiers who are training seem to think that the Russian regular army would be a tougher proposition for them to take on than the Wagner forces. And for all I know, that might be true. The paratroopers who are apparently there, Russian paratroopers who are there in Bakhmut, are apparently extremely tough soldiers. And of course, the regular military will have tanks and infantry fighting vehicles and such things. They will be mechanized and armored to an extent that Wagner, up to now, is not. So just saying. But the thing that really stood out for me in this article is that the reporters from The Guardian could not help but notice that several of these people who were training in this force supposedly to retake Bakhmut were civilians with no background in the military, who'd recently been enlisted and who'd been prepared to be thrown into the battle. And it's clear that the training that they're getting is of very limited duration and extent. One of these people, by the way, is a woman, a young woman. And one does wonder about what the overall condition of the Ukrainian army is if soldiers who are being told that they're going to go on the attack to capture Bakhmut, recapture Bakhmut from the Russian regular army, if Ukraine has to throw into the battle reservists and poorly trained reservists, including a young woman, in that kind of way. Anyway, I think the Russians are aware, as I said, of the overall state of the Ukrainian army. And I can't help but think that they must be saying to themselves, well, given how depleted the Ukrainian army is, how depleted its ammunition is, the fact that we're carrying out all of these strikes on their ammunition facilities, perhaps at some point, if the Ukrainians won't help us by launching their own offensive, maybe at some point, rather than just sit and wait for them, we should go out and go after them. We should launch an offensive ourselves. And you could see how all of these air and missile strikes that have been taking place across Ukraine. By the way, even as I am making this program, there's more reports of more Russian air and missile strikes across Ukraine, including especially, again in Kiev, by the way, I believe, but also on the front lines near Avdiivka and such places. But anyway, these operations could be said to be preparing the ground for an offensive, a Russian offensive as well. Perhaps not a big arrow offensive, perhaps the Russians will act incrementally as they always do, focusing first and foremost on clearing Donbass, perhaps then pushing on towards the Dnieper. Well, we'll see. Anyway, the Russians have given one further clue that they might be thinking in this way, because Russian officials have now, for the first time, confirmed that one of the purposes of the Russian missile strikes on Kiev is to destroy Kiev's air defense system. They said that the last set of strikes that took place yesterday specifically targeted Kiev's air defense system. They say that these strikes were successful. No way, of course, of independently corroborating that, but that's what the Russians say. And that, in effect, as far as I can see, supports what I was saying yesterday, that the Russians are attacking Kiev in part to force Ukraine to concentrate its air defense assets in Kiev. And then, of course, they go after those air defense assets whilst they're there, reducing even further Ukraine's ability to provide air cover to its troops or the infrastructure dispersed across the country. So that brings me back to what I was discussing before. We see that even Stoltenberg and Ben Wallace now admit that the bottom of the barrel has been reached. There isn't anything more the West can supply. They still want Ukraine to go ahead with this offensive nonetheless. And of course, it doesn't seem as if they've got much of a plan of what to do in military terms if that offensive fails. One person, I will call him Western leader, does seem to be showing at least some understanding of the situation. And I have to say that is Viktor Orban of Hungary. Now, I know that there are many people who've watched this program who are critical of Orban, and I can understand why. But realistically, in relation to this war, he has been the only European leader who has had the courage to speak out and to say things as it is, as they are, and he's resisted the whole idea of the economic war. He's criticised the entire approach the Western powers have taken, and events, it seems to me, are effectively confirming much of what he has said. Anyway, Orban has now made the point that the most important thing, the priority now, should be to stop the Ukrainian offensive. He makes the point that he was briefly in the Hungarian army. This had been presumably in the time when it was part of the Warsaw Pact. He's admitted that he was only there for a relatively short time, presumably as a conscript, but he says that even that gives him some understanding of military matters. And he says, he makes it fairly clear that he expects this offensive to fail. And he says that regardless of that, it's bound to result in the deaths of thousands of men. And given that Ukraine has a far smaller population than Russia's, that its military is run down, that he doesn't actually say the next point, but he implies it, that the West can't replace the weapons and ammunition that Ukraine would throw away over the course of this offensive. He's making the straightforward, common sense, humane plea. He says, let's call this offensive off. Let's call the offensive off and let's sit down and talk. Let's look for a diplomatic solution to this conflict with the Russians. Let's open negotiations with them. Now, this, it seems to me, is basic sense. It makes so much more sense than that very complex, intricate, clever, empty speech that Emmanuel Macron just gave in Bratislava. Macron acknowledged, first Western leader to do so, that the Ukrainian offensive might fail. And then he said, if the offensive fails, the Ukrainian offensive fails, we will have to recalibrate our policy towards Russia. But he didn't spell out what he means by that. And given that he openly acknowledges that there is at least a possibility that the offensive will fail, why is he still advocating it? Why does he talk about an offensive which Ukraine should launch, but which he accepts might fail and which might require a whole mysterious process of recalibration? It's classic Macron. He doesn't ever clearly set out what he thinks. Sometimes I wonder whether he actually has any real ideas, whether this isn't just a book of words which is completely empty of meaning. By contrast, Orban, who, as I said, I know many people have strong feelings about, he takes, it seems to me, the logical and humane approach. He says Ukraine and the West cannot achieve anything from this offensive. The only thing that is guaranteed is that a lot of men, Ukrainian men, are going to die. And they're going to die to no purpose. So let's end this war now. Let's agree a ceasefire. Let's sit down with the Russians and talk. It speaks of the utter moral bankruptcy of Western policy that nobody up to now is agreeing with Orban. They all continue to press for this offensive. And as I discussed at the start of this program, we have people like Ben Wallace and Jens Stoltenberg, and of course other US officials, including Biden himself, telling Ukraine, well, you must launch this offensive. You've got all the weapons you're going to get. You have enough. The Russians are supposedly in an even worse situation than you. So fortune favours the brave. Launch this offensive and perhaps it will work. I mean, the humanity of Orban's perspective against the cynicism of the position taken by people like Stoltenberg and Wallace and others who clearly insist on this offensive taking place, well, it leaves me speechless. It's all I can say, and that's not something people often say about me. But anyway, there we go. So, of course, Orban is not going to be listened to. This offensive will take place this summer. At some point, I am sure it will probably fail. If it doesn't take place, look to the real possibility that the Russians might start their an offensive of their own soon. And anyway, it looks as if they decided to resolve the unfinished business in Marinika and Avdiivka and probably Kupyansk and Seversk as well. So that's probably what we're going to see over the summer. It's possible that after the summer, the mood in Europe is going to start to change. We see strong signs now that both Germany and Britain are going to fall into deeper recession. There's an election coming in in Spain, where after the Spanish Socialist Party, which is the ruling party, did badly in regional elections, the Spanish Prime Minister, Mr. Sanchez, has gambled, appears to be gambling that if he calls the election now, he will either be able to limit the losses or perhaps scare many people in Spain with the spectre of the right-wing Vox party winning a significant number of seats in the Spanish parliament, the Cortes, and allying itself with the main Conservative Party and perhaps obtaining a voice in the government. Who's to say? Now, what I will say about that is this: if that happens in Spain, then perhaps we could start to see, if there is an election in Spain, it could be that over the course of that election, this topic of Ukraine and the war will finally be opened up and people will start to talk about it. I understand that there's elections also pending in Slovakia, and apparently their critics of the war are gaining ground. We shall see. But it looks to me that the political clock in Europe might be starting to tick down, just as of course in the United States, with the presidential elections coming next year, it is arguably starting to do the same. And though I don't want to talk about President Biden's frailties, physical frailties, I am always uncomfortable doing such things. The fact that he's had some falls recently probably will reinforce doubts amongst not just American voters, but amongst parts of the political class about whether he is really the president that the United States needs at times like this. So it's possible that after what I expect is going to be a very hot summer in Ukraine, hot not just in terms of weather, but in terms of the fighting as well, it could be that as the weather turns cooler, minds will concentrate in Europe and in the United States, and we could start to see some serious negotiations, or at least proposals, take place. I can't say that I'm confident, but Li Hui, the Chinese emissary, has said that after speaking to all the parties in the conflict in Europe, in Ukraine, in Russia, he does sense that everybody does want to see a solution to this conflict. He left out the Americans, by the way. We'll see whether he's right. But anyway, until then, the temperatures in Ukraine, I expect, are going to rise, both climatically and in terms of the fighting. And if this summer offensive does indeed happen, as I expect, perhaps disastrously so. Well, that's me for the day. There'll be more from me soon. Just to remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms rather, BitChute, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. You can also go to our shop and buy the various things that we have there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again for joining me today. More from me soon.